Welcome to the Working Genius podcast, where we discuss anything and everything related to the 6 types of working genius and how it impacts your work and your life. I'm Pat Lencioni, your host today, joined by Beau, Cody, and Tracy. I'm not going to ask you how you are because you look awesome. I've got Karen here with me and Matt, the whole crew. And so, Cody, what is our topic today?
Nail your next job interview.
That's right. We're going to talk about how to change the way you interview using Working Genius to avoid the 2 really bad things that happen when we don't interview well. And it has a lot to do with how we understand ourselves. Okay? So that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, I should say this. In addition to all this, you want to be humble, hungry, and smart. You want to be that. That's how you show somebody that you're going to be a good team player. So we know that's important. But what about finding the right job? Avoiding getting the wrong job that would make you miserable, or avoiding interviewing in a way that you lose out on the right job. So that's what we're going to talk about today, how to avoid those 2 things.
Pat, I think this is going to be a really fun conversation because so many people, when they're going into a job interview, they're told, or they've heard many times, like, you're interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you. But what they tend to think is, oh, that means I have to ask questions about what are the benefits like and what's the culture, culture of the company. And very little of that is about the fit of the actual job and how satisfied you'll be if and when you get that job. And so it's so fun to be able to have this conversation. And I think we're going to talk about this as if we're addressing the job seeker, not just the listeners here, but like if you know someone who's seeking a job, let's have this conversation so that we can send this podcast to them and we're talking directly to that audience.
Yeah, and what I like about this conversation is if you were to look up interview tips, most of the advice you would probably find is advice we were all given when we were first interviewing, which is more or less a riff on how to trick somebody into liking you in an interview. It's things like mirroring body language and get them to talk and do all of that. And does that actually help you evaluate if this is the right job for you? No. If you think about interviewing like it's a date and you're just trying to get to the next date, it doesn't give you any more clarity. But if you go into an interview knowing I can actually give them clarity about if I'm right for them and if they're right for me, and we think the best and fastest tool to do that, of course, is Working Genius. So, right. Pat, you alluded to early on that there's 2 big problems in an interview. What is the first one of those?
Well, the first one is talking your way into a job that you shouldn't be getting. And I was just writing this down as you were talking about. I was thinking that, as you said, the purpose of interviewing is not to get the job. Mm-hmm. The purpose of interviewing is to get the job that you can be, that is right for you. That doesn't mean it's perfect. And especially if you're just getting out of college, we want to talk about how this is so important for college grads. You're not going to get the perfect job, and that's okay. But you should avoid the worst job for you. And that's how Working Genius is so important. And I will tell you, the first 2 jobs I interviewed for after college, I went into those interviews thinking the only thing I was supposed to do is get them to offer me a job. And I survived them by the grace of God, and I learned some things through that. But I spent my first 2 years out of college in a job that I was destined to fail at and hate. But I didn't understand that. And if I could go back and do it all over again or give advice to somebody who was going through that, I would say it's probably never the right thing to try to get a job that is unsuited for you, because it's only going to destroy your confidence and lead to a year or 2 of misery. But you got to know what the wrong job is in order to avoid that.
Yeah, so let's double click into that. I'm just thinking there's probably a lot of people who this episode was shared with them, and this might be the first time that they're even learning about Working Genius. So, Cody, Working Genius helps us understand our geniuses and our frustrations. Can you just connect the dots for us of if somebody is going into a job, how they might know that a job would be miserable for them?
Yeah, this is actually great to do a quick overview, because if you're listening to this for the first time and we're using letters like D and G and T, so let's just do the quickest flyover in terms of, hey, here's what Working Genius is. And essentially, go ahead, Pat.
Well, what I want to say is, and for those people that listen to this podcast all the time, they're going, why are you doing this? Because we think this podcast is going to be something that people are going to give to somebody who's interviewing, whether it's a college grad or a friend who's in between jobs. And so as a result, we want to do this update, not for our regular listeners, but for those people that are coming into this. So for our regular listeners, we're going to do it quickly, but this will make it easier for you to forward this episode on.
Okay, so here's the concept, right? So there's a lot of personality assessments out there. There's a lot of things that help us understand how we show up and become more self-aware. And there's Myers-Briggs and StrengthsFinder and all of those. And Working Genius is a simple way for us to understand all the elements of work. Pat, you've distilled it down to 6 activities that happen in any job or initiative. And then which of those activities lend themselves to where we are going to show up, be most successful and most fulfilled. So in some ways, this quick flyover, as you're listening to this, you've taken the assessment, you might say there's two areas that are going to sound like these are the most fulfilling and satisfying. If I could do a lot of work in this area, that'd be fantastic. That's your Working Genius. On the other end of the spectrum, and when you ask the question, Beau, what type of work should I avoid? We call this your working frustration. There's going to be 2 areas that when you hear them, you're like, boy, if the majority of that job falls into those 2 categories, I'm going to be unfulfilled. I'm going to be unsuccessful. It's going to lead to frustration for me and the coworkers that I am on a team with. And then 2 in the middle, which are called working competencies, which is like, I can do those for a little bit, but I should likely avoid them if I possibly can. So here's the quick, go ahead, Pat.
Well, I was just going to say, I didn't know if you were done yet. I want you to finish, Cody, but I'm going to tell the story of how this would have saved me earlier in my career because I wasn't thinking about this at all. But I didn't know you weren't finished yet, Cody. So go ahead.
Well, let's go through all 6 real fast so that people have some context for that. And then I'd love for you to apply it to how you would have understood the jobs and how they fit you early on in your career. So the first activity in any type of work is wonder. And the people with the genius of wonder love to ponder the bigger picture. They love to realize untapped potential. They look around at their environment. And so they're comfortable sitting and pondering what is possible. Right. And that's the first activity of any really well done project or type of work is let's identify the potential so that we can move to the next activity, which is invention. Invention, people with the genius of invention love coming up with new ideas, a blank whiteboard or a problem to solve and no parameters to solve it. So they like to come up with very little restrictions on what the possibilities of solving that initial wonder question would be. And then you need the next genius, which is the genius of discernment. So someone with the genius of discernment has really good gut feel, intuition around evaluating those ideas, refining them, making them better, or selecting the ideas. So they have Tracy, this is your calling card, is just instincts and good judgment around helping us determine what the right ideas are. And then the next activity is galvanizing. Once we've wondered the right question, we've invented the right or a solution, we've discerned which one is the right one to go after. We need someone with the gift of galvanizing that goes and rallies the team or the organization around that goal. So they love being up front, circling the wagons, pushing people outside of their comfort zone, all in service of getting momentum around the idea. The next activity is the genius of enablement. So people respond to the call of the galvanizer. And the person with enablement says, they're the first person to raise their hand and say, I am here to help. I want to help you get this off the ground. They're very relational focused. They're glue on a team, and they help you move from just galvanizing, the language of like getting momentum around it, to actually the first stages of implementation. And then finally to tenacity, which is, this is the genius where they live for pushing things across the finish line. They love not waiting or not satisfied to see a project at the 2-yard line. They want to punch it in the end zone. And so they actually love seeing the results of that idea impacted in the world. So they make sure that they get it through to the finish line on time, and they're very task oriented to ensure that goal. So that's the quick flyover, Pat. So 2 of those will land in your Working Genius. Boy, if I could do those all day, that would be amazing. Mm-hmm. And we say this, every job is a 6-letter job. You're never going to go into an interview and say, I'm only good at these 2 things, and that's the only thing I want to do. But the order of them matters. And then the 2 in your frustration, you should definitely avoid. So Pat, after that quick flyover, I'd love to hear if you knew that going into the first handful of interviews that you did, how would that have changed your trajectory?
Yeah, and see the thing about it is so I was, how old was I? 21 years old, and I'm or 20 probably, because I'm still in school and I'm interviewing. That's why kids in college need to take this assessment right now. We're at the early March, not in May and June when they graduate, because they're interviewing right now. So if you want to send the best graduation gift, send it now. Say, here's your first graduation gift. Use this now as you're interviewing so you can avoid misery in your work. Because when I was interviewing, now I know I'm not going to get the perfect job. I know that. Nobody has the perfect job when you get out of school. If you do, that's kind of odd. But you shouldn't start with the wrong job, with a horrible job for you, because that's going to damage your self-esteem and it's going to frustrate you and you're going to feel guilty. So I went to look at all the companies that were interviewing on campus, and there was one that was listed as the best job in America that year. So everybody signed up to interview with that, and I was a good interviewer, I guess, and I kept talking my way from interview to interview, and then I got the job offer, and people said, congratulations, you've just succeeded. Well, had I been aware of my working geniuses at the time, and more importantly, my working frustrations, I would have interviewed and discovered that the two things they needed me to do most were the two things I hated doing the most, which means there was no way I could possibly go in there and be successful, learn as much as I needed to learn, and enjoy myself. It was 2 years of true misery. Okay. And so what I should have done if I'd known that now is said, okay, my two areas of frustration are enablement and tenacity. And I would have asked them, so what will I be doing and how will that work? And they'd have explained to me, we're going to tell you exactly what to do, and you're going to go do it perfectly and do it on time. And you're not going to have really any input into what we ask you to do. And we're not really looking for you to use your ideas or your judgment. We're going to tell you what to do. Just say yes and finish it. Well, that is the definition of failure for me. And yet I talked my way into a job that was going to crush me for 2 more years.
And see, what everybody goes into an interview knows you're going to get asked is, hey, tell me about your biggest limitation or your biggest weakness. And every single one of us are stuck. Because you can't say, well, I'm too hardworking and I care too much, or I don't have very good boundaries. But to give an honest answer means that you might diminish yourself in front of this other person. And Working Genius gives you language to be able to talk about the type of work that frustrates you. And not only that, but when you're aware of your frustrations, you give somebody insight into how self-aware you are. And we all want to hire and work with people who are self-aware and humble.
Beau, I'm so glad you used that phrase. I've been on a couple calls in the last month with business schools at universities. And on both of those calls, when they're talking about, hey, what are our goals for the people that come through our business school as they go out into the workplace? And the word self-awareness was the primary thing. Like they're like, boy, in the past, we've over-indexed on making them employable based on some technical skill. And we found out that like they get into these jobs and they're not totally self-aware about who they are and what they're good at and what they're not good at. And what I love that you said, and Pat, this ties so much into our methodology around building trust, right? Is vulnerability actually builds trust. And when you're in an interview and they ask you what your weaknesses are, they're not actually looking for you to tell them like, here's why I wouldn't be good at the job. They're actually seeing how trustworthy you are. Do you know yourself well enough to know what your weaknesses are? And are you willing in this interview to be vulnerable enough with the person on the other side of the table to say, hey, I'm not sure I'd be that good at this thing. And that can go a long way in an interview.
Yeah, but I will actually disagree with part of it. It's good to tell them, hey, I'm not good at these things, because if that is what they're looking at, help them cross you off the list and get you out of the pool, because you're not doing anybody any good by not letting them cancel you. The next best answer to yes is no. And if somebody is really looking for a detailed person and they go into the interview and say, hey, what are your weaknesses? And you go, let me tell you, I am not the most detailed follow-up person in the world. And here's how that plays out. Please kick me out of the interview process if that's what this job is about. So I think we have to be comfortable enough to be rejected for the right reasons, and we need to celebrate that rather than feel like rejection is a bad thing.
It's so good. And the other part of that equation is then knowing what your geniuses are. Because inevitably in an interview, somebody's going to ask you about what are your strengths? What is it that you bring to a team? And Working Genius gives you the language to be able to go, again, humbly, confidently, in a self-aware way to say, hey, here is what I do. Even when it's not required, here's the work that I do that gives me joy and energy to contribute to a team.
Yeah, and see, that's a great point. That's the other side of this. So one side is you talk your way into a bad job for you because one man's trash is another man's treasure. So another person says, this is a great job, and it might not be for you. But the other side is, and it's related, is that we might not actually boldly present ourselves for what we're good at because we're so generic and peanut buttering out everything. When you know what you're bad at and you can say that, you can also say, but here's what I love. And if you're looking for somebody who can do these things, then I would be the right person for you. You know, my dad told me when I was younger, and my dad interviewed for 2 jobs in his lifetime. So I don't know how he knew this, God rest his soul. But he said, Pat, make sure when you interview, best advice I ever got about interviewing, make sure they know that you really want the job. Right? But that was predicated on the fact that you really did want the job.
Right.
And there's certain jobs that I shouldn't want because I'd be terrible at them. So when you know what you're terrible at, you then also know what you're good at. And when you go to that job interview and you say, hey, if you're looking for somebody who can do these things, I would be really good for that. But if you're looking for somebody to do these other things, I wouldn't. It's like when you go to the waiter at the restaurant, you say, what's the best thing you have on the menu? And they tell you, and then you go, what's not good? And they tell you. I trust that their answer is on the positive is a good one because they're willing to say, the fish isn't so good here, but the burger is fantastic.
Yeah. I love how much energy you're bringing and all of us to this conversation, even before we hit record. And as I'm sitting here, I'm like, oh, I think I realized that we're so passionate about this because each of us has actually been in an interview where we took a job that caused us misery and pain for at least a number of years. And then self-doubt, it leads to self-doubt. Then you wonder, like, am I ever going to find something where I fit? And there's so many people listening to this that are like, oh, in my previous job, I don't feel like I was fulfilled and I don't know what to even look for. And I think that there's so much passion and energy around this because of the impact it could have. Is like, just imagine if 10% of the people that receive this really articulate what type of job they want and get into those roles and how the impact it'll have not only on their personal satisfaction, their family, the team that they're on, the company that they serve. Like this is monumental in the way it could impact the world of work. And too often we just distill it down to, you know, I have 5 interviews and I need a job by June. So I better take one of these and rent's due, you know? And I'm hopeful that this is helpful as people start evaluating, like, I only want the job that is right for me, that I can contribute the best at and feel fulfilled in. And sometimes that can sound too idealistic. So if you're just getting out of college, for instance, okay, you don't have to have the perfect, but do not take a miserable job. Do not take a horrible job. You know, and the problem is when you're in school, you're meant to try to get an A in every class. Don't get an A in your interviews. It's better to get an F on an interview because you're honest and they don't hire you. Getting an A on an interview for a job that you don't like is no longer something that's desirable. And yet, up until that moment of our lives, we're trying to ace everything we do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is something that is so counterintuitive and countercultural because we are programmed to sell ourselves, especially college students. That we're constantly told, like, sell yourself. So given that, what are some, I mean, it's easy for us to sit here and say, oh yeah, talk about your working frustrations, talk about your geniuses. But what are some practical tips that you can give folks that are not as familiar with this content on how to interview, how to embed this content into an interview?
I think the thing is, it's really about asking questions and trying to figure out if, and you should get more excited during the interview if you realize that you could be successful there and they'll notice that. And you should get more sober and honest if you realize you shouldn't. Like, so I had a kid in a class. I taught a class of kids that are just about to graduate last year from college. And they were interviewing at the time, and they did Working Genius. And so I went around the room and I was doing everybody's Working Genius, like, what are you? What are you? What are you? And this one kid goes, okay, I have a job And my working genius is WE, I think it was. So he's a wanderer and an enabler. I said, okay, what job did you get? And he goes, cold call sales.
Oh.
Which to me was like, oh, that's going to be horrible. And I said to him, okay, I don't want to be, I said, you realize that's going to mean like getting people to do things they don't want to do. I explained to him disruptive versus responsive and all this stuff. And I said, do you think you're going to do well in that job and like it? And he had this look on his face. He said, no, I think I'm going to hate it. Better to find that out now. And I know people are like, well, that's a high class problem. He needs a job. Actually having the wrong job, and again, not the perfect job. Nobody's going to have the perfect job, but having the perfectly wrong job is way worse than continuing to look for a job. Because it's going to crush your spirit. It's going to damage a lot of your lifestyle. Find a job that's not miserable. That's saying my job doesn't suck. That should be the t-shirt you have. I want a job that doesn't suck for me.
I love that you went right at asking questions because, of course, in an interview, we should also be asking questions of the job we're interviewing for to learn more about that role. A job description is rarely all that helpful, right? Because it was probably just copied and pasted and it's overly formal. So I would be asking questions about the primary type of work that they're looking for somebody to do. The problem with job interviews, or one of the problems that everybody at one point in their life has bemoaned, is they're looking for somebody with experience. Well, who's ever going to give me the first experience, right? How do I break into a market if I don't have experience there? And the other side of that coin is, if you only have experience in marketing, it feels like you can only go get a job in marketing. But to what Cody was talking about before, there's 6 phases of work in all marketing. There's 6 phases of work in finance. There's 6 phases of work if you're running for trying to become a teacher or running for office or whatever. Every type of job has all 6 types. And so you ought to know, what type of work do they need you to do most? Hey, is this mostly blocking and tackling and you've done this before and you know the plan? Or do you need somebody to go reinvent the marketing plan? Do you need somebody who sits in the middle between the ideas and the activation or the implementation of those ideas?
You know what? This is so interesting, Beau. When you were saying that, I thought, imagine a career fair at a college, right? And you walk in there and there's somebody that has marketing or finance or all the different functions. It would actually be better if they had the working geniuses up, because the industry you're in is far less indicative of whether you're going to succeed or like your work than the kind of kind of work you're going to have to do. And if they said, okay, ID's over here and ET's over here and so they don't do that. So it's our job as people looking for work to help the employer, the prospective employer, explain to us whether or not we can be successful. Mm-hmm. And again, that doesn't mean, I'll say it again, it doesn't mean it's got to be perfect. What it means, though, it shouldn't be perfectly miserable. Because if it's perfectly miserable, you're begging for problems.
Yeah, and even thinking about, we titled this "Nail Your Next Job Interview," and regardless of where you are in your age or you're a job seeker, is like, I can't imagine. In fact, I just had an interaction with a listener of ours who listens to this stuff. She's a little young, on the younger side, and she was like, even sitting in an interview and saying, "Hey, I've taken this assessment about who I am and the way I contribute to teams, and kind of have an understanding of the way work happens, and I'm self-aware enough to know where I fit into that." Like, if you're a hiring manager, you're sitting on the other side of the table, you're like, "Oh my gosh. This person is so not only just interested in themselves and becoming more self-aware, they've learned about teamwork. There's elements here that it's not just describing what your geniuses are, but showing interest in how teams operate and how you fit into how teams operate and the type of work that you do. That alone would give you an advantage in an interview, as opposed to people who walk in and go, "Well, I read the job description and here's my years of experience with this and this." There shows some like interest and proactivity. And I think that gives you an edge right out of the gate just with that.
I agree, Cody. And you know what I just realized too? Very few people, when they're interviewing somebody for a job, really is it cast in stone exactly how it is. I mean, people think that, oh, well, they're here on campus or they're here interviewing for this job. Half the time when they learn, if they like you and they think you're a fit for their culture, if you're honest about your strengths and weaknesses, they will put you in a job that suits you. But if you don't tell them who you are, then they're going to put you in this generic job thinking that you're going to have to do that. And very few jobs in the world today are hard cast in terms of what you do. And I love that story. I think it was one of your friends, Beau or Cody, I can't remember which one it was, who went to his performance review and he was going to get a bad one. He knew that. And he brought his working genius in and he got promoted. And so he turned a negative performance review into an interview, essentially, because once he showed them what he was good or not good at, they said, well, we have you in the wrong job. Let's promote you into this other job because you'll be great at it. And so the point here is, don't think that the job they're presenting to you is the only thing they have. Go tell them your story, what you're not good at, what you're really good at, and what you could do okay. And they might very well rethink the job if they think you're a good person.
So let's just net this out. A few practical next steps if you're listening to this. If you're listening to this and you love your job, amazing. I'm happy for you. You probably know somebody who's looking for work, who's thinking about their next job, their dream job, or anything but this job, right? Or a graduate who's 3 or 4 months away from needing to get a job, and just sending them this episode can be really helpful. We've talked about that. If you are one of those job seekers, here's what you do. We'll put the link in the show notes below. You'll go take the assessment. It will take 10 to 12 minutes. You'll then get a report, read through the report, and here's the secret sauce. In that report, you'll be able to circle some phrases that you'll be able to bring to the table in your interview about you and your ability to help activate things. We have a name for each of the pairings of these two geniuses that that will help you have better self-awareness and really help you know how to be able to describe yourself when you're in that interview, and maybe even in your resume or application. Because we want you to have less job misery, and that starts by helping to pick a job where you will not be as miserable.
Right, because you should not be. The wrong job, some people think, oh, that's a high-class problem. No, the wrong job, a really bad one for you, means more burnout, less confidence, and less joy. And that's not a good thing. Having not the perfect job is fine. Now, I think that if you're older, if you're 25 and you've been in the workplace, or 35, 45, 55, 65, and you're doing this, I think that you're looking for that ideal. And so understanding your working genius. But I'll tell you what, even if you're 21 years old and you're leaving school right now, you're entitled to not take a bad job. And here's, I think, the number one thing I'm going to say as we wrap this up. When you go to interview, do not be afraid of being rejected for the right reason. Being rejected for the right reason is a victory. Okay? Being rejected for the wrong reason is not. But have the courage to go in there and say, if this job isn't for me, then God willing, we're going to figure it out together, and I'm going to be the happiest person to walk out of that room and say, whoo, I dodged a bullet. So I think that's a good thing. Have that courage to do that. All righty?
Great.
All right, that brings us to the end of our podcast today. Go out and, if you know of somebody who's graduating in 3 months or 4 months, man, be the best aunt or uncle in the world, or friend or neighbor, and help them figure this out now. All righty, thanks for joining us on the Working Genius podcast. We really appreciate it. God bless.